I think that Maciel, with his uncontrollable sexual urges, founded the Legion of Christ to have his own harem of young boys.
He wanted me to lie naked at the sight of him.
We were an archipelago of solitudes. That's exactly how it was.
In Martial Maciel's case, all the characteristics of a sect are present.
213 documents. The church knew all about it, everything.
It's impossible to open a file on Father Maciel because he's a person held in high esteem by the Holy Father. And he's done a lot of good for the church. I'm sorry, but it isn't wise.
When I look back on my time in the Legion, I see only lies, 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 lies. It never stops. It's an event that always stayed with me. A euphoric crowd of young people, the Pope arriving in his Pope-mobile, the emotion in the crowd. All the young people attending the event were bubbling with excitement. Everything was perfect. The weather was beautiful, music was playing in the background, the atmosphere was simply amazing.
If that day of August 21st, 1997 has left such a deep impression on Xavier Léger, it's because amidst the fervor of the World Youth Day event, he meets a man of the church who's going to change his life.
I thought he was a priest, but in fact he was a deacon. There was so much noise with the megaphones, etc., that I could hardly hear him. But I understood that he was a deacon who was about to be ordained priest. He was extremely well groomed, hair slicked back with gel, shiny black shoes, very elegant and refined. I felt honored being approached by him. We talked for a few minutes, I gave him my phone number, and a few days later he called me.
Without knowing it, Xavier Léger has just been approached by a recruiter of the Legionaries of Christ, a Catholic congregation founded 55 years earlier and present on every continent. The Legion of Christ has provided 1,000 priests to the Catholic Church, and its influence at the Vatican is continually growing. 2 years later, in 1999, Xavier Léger will himself become a Legionary of Christ. To feel the true weight of the Legionaries of Christ in the Catholic Church, one needs to go to Mexico. Here, religion is one of the pillars of the Republic. Some even consider that the Mexican Church is a state within a state. The Legion of Christ story begins in the state of Michoacán, a 7-hour drive away from Mexico City. Here we are in Cotija de la Paz, a small town of 12,000 inhabitants. Cotija, its tranquility, its simple lifestyle, and its museum. A museum where this region's eventful history is displayed. On a wall are photos of the town's illustrious characters. And among them we discover a certain Maciel Degollado, born in Cotija in 1920. Young Maciel, who will have 10 brothers and sisters, comes from an ultra-Catholic background. 3 of his uncles are bishops. It's almost natural then that he enter the seminary in his turn. He's 16 years old at the time. In 1941, at the age of 21, he's ordained priest. Very soon afterwards, he founds a congregation that will later be named the Legionaries of Christ. His aim is to train novice priests and introduce Jesus to as many people as possible. In 2002, 6 years before his death, Maciel was still relating the story of how the Legion of Christ came into existence.
I think all of this is due to the action of the Holy Spirit, to God's action. And the way in which he was able, through me, to perform his work.
From as early as 1944, rumors began circulating about what was going on within the small community of legionaries. There was talk of sexual abuse committed by Maciel, who was also said to be a morphine addict. There was talk of harsh discipline and unorthodox teaching methods. In Mexico City, we found some of the early members of the Legion of Christ, scarred men who 65 years later still haven't forgotten. In their nightmares, the same image returns incessantly. The infirmary, this place where Maciel, who we see here in bed, suffering from a so-called urinary tract disorder, entices young seminarians, children aged between 10 and 16 years old.
The very first night when he sexually abused me by masturbating me, I was petrified. I knew that any form of sexual contact was a sin. But in my child's mind, I couldn't imagine that such a saintly man as he, a priest, could commit such shameful acts with me.
He ended up masturbating me against my will, violently. He was 35 and I was a young boy of 16, 17. He claimed that his so-called illness, an infection of the urogenital tracts, necessitated special treatments, such as sexual favors and masturbations, for example. I know because I was a victim of it. I was a victim of these lies several times. Everything took place in a very hushed atmosphere, in the semi-darkness even, of what was then called the infirmary. But over and above the medical pretext, he used another argument, church authority. As a way of convincing me, he told me that he had a special authorization from the Holy Father, Pius XII. The nuns could massage his genitals to relieve him and thus avoid the so-called sperm-urine conflict. I only understood what a young boy of my age could understand at that time.
Father Maciel would come to see us from time to time. And then I remember it vividly, we'd hear shouting coming from his room, the sound of furniture being moved. As an explanation, we were told that he was wrestling with the devil.
I was convinced that my vocation at this man's side was a very special one. I told myself that God must undoubtedly want me to help this man, whose destiny was so extraordinary, even though all of this filled me with humiliation and disgust. But I looked upon it as a sort of sacrifice.
After having been abused for a whole night, young 13-year-old Juan Jose Vaca dares demand an explanation from Maciel the next morning.
Maciel said to me, "But you haven't committed a sin. It's a charitable act because you've enabled me to overcome the pain. It was a pious act that you did for me, a virtuous act, not a sin." I answered, "No, it's not. I've committed a sin. Listen," he said, "to stop you worrying, I'm going to give you absolution. In the name of the Father, the Son, you have no cause to be worried anymore." But I'll say it again, he was everything to me. He was my confessor, my father, my mother. He was everything. I had no one else.
This is the mechanism Maciel as seducer put in place. Anything connected with deviant practices such as masturbation came supposedly from wild imaginings or madness. Maciel used this well-functioning dissociative mechanism to achieve his ends. He perfected it little by little in Rome. He was capable of going straight from the infirmary where he raped children to the chapel. This man, after having spent some time with one or several young legionnaires, could then serve Mass in the most devout manner possible, holding up the Blessed Sacrament for several long minutes during consecration. This is totally dissociative behavior. Those who were present at just some scenes could have only a fragmented view of Maciel.
I think that Maciel, with his uncontrollable sexual urges, founded the Legion of Christ to have his own harem of young boys. That was his real motivation for founding the Legion of Christ, to have a group with whom he could satisfy his overflowing sexual, pansexual appetite.
Pansexual.
If the secret of Maciel's crime has been so well kept, it's above all due to the law of silence imposed upon the legionaries of Christ. The young legionary of Christ has taken a vow of charity, which constrains him never to question a superior. Thus, nothing passes beyond the walls of the Legion seminaries.
When a child or adolescent was the victim of sexual abuse in the Legion, he couldn't talk about it to anyone, not only because of this vow of secrecy, of charity, which forbade him from questioning a superior, but also due to a system of inside complicity. We were overprotected. Nothing could pass beyond these walls. It was impossible.
This rule of absolute silence has always existed in the Legion of Christ. In the early 2000s, Xavier Léger was subjected to it throughout his 7 years in the congregation.
It's terrible, because we all lived together, yet had no idea what the others were going through, because legionaries didn't have the right to speak, especially critically. They don't have the right to have special friendships. And they can only speak about their problems to the people designated by God for this purpose, that is, their superiors, who happen to be their spiritual advisors. So we didn't know. And it's only years later, when I got back in contact with some of my former companions, thanks to the social networks, that I discovered that all these people who shared my life in the Legion, who were smiling and joyful, radiant even sometimes, were in fact going through a living hell.
There was no one we could talk to. There was no intermediary superior to whom we could say, "Our father did this to me," for example. I felt a lot of compassion for the others. The depth of our souls depended in large part on having the ability to sense the solitude of others. I remember that during our walks, I would forget my own sadness by sensing the great distress of my brothers and companions. I sympathized with them because I knew that they were going through the same thing as myself. A few years ago, when I wrote an essay entitled "The Reasons for My Silence," I described that we were in an archipelago of solitudes. And that's exactly how it was.
As early as 1946, Maciel already wants to conquer the world. In parallel with the Legion, he founded the Regnum Christi, a movement made up of thousands of lay Catholics whose mission is to recruit future seminarians and attract generous donators. The Legion of Christ is soon going to expand rapidly and spread to other parts of the world. After Cotilla in Mexico City, it's Francoist Spain that welcomes Maciel and his group of exiled young Mexicans with open arms. One of the first Legion of Christ centers here will be this house in Comillas on the Atlantic coast. Sent thousands of miles away from their homes, separated from their families who they won't see again for months, years even, deprived of every form of freedom, the young seminarians are thrown into a parallel universe far removed from that of childhood. One of the weapons employed by the Legionaries of Christ to recruit new members is the charm and the warmth of the welcome. Paul Lennon, who left his parents in his native Ireland to join the Legion of Christ, recollects.
Waiting there to welcome us was a large group of legionaries who had come by bus from Rome and Salamanca. A few years later, I realized it was a sort of love bombardment, but we couldn't know that then. "Oh, you're the first Irish legionaries, welcome, welcome." And they give us that special legionary embrace, all of that. They even sang for us, followed by that typically Mexican embrace again.
The main problem with the Legion of Christ is the depersonalization process. And one of the specificities of the Legionnaires is that they are robots, beautiful robots, nice to look at, clean and well-behaved, physically attractive. The Legionnaire is thus going to steal the soul of the others once he himself has lost his soul.
En el caso de Marcial Maciel tiene todas las características de una secta.
In Marcial Maciel's case, all the characteristics of a sect are present. He's the leader, the founder, the one who gives them everything. In 1946, these children are separated from their families, a common practice at the time, then taken to Spain. They are uprooted from their homes, and their daily life now revolves around all of this. In this context, everything is done to conceal the acts of pedophilia because the head man is not only the founder, but also the spiritual father, the one who hears your confession, who has control over you and over what you say to him.
This image of the superior being will be cultivated by Maciel throughout his entire life. Thus, in this film made in praise of him in 2002, we see him alternately as a devout priest, as a man curious about things of the world, as a confidant, as a tireless empire builder, as a generous guide. In short, a saintly being.
Father Maciel led such an extraordinary life that in himself alone he combined together the lives of all the great saints. He was at the same time St. Paul, St. John Bosco, St. Jean-Marie Vianney. He'd accomplished the miracles of each one of them. The whole training system is targeted at promoting the figure of the superior. At the time I was there, in any case, it was the figure of Father Maciel that was extolled to an excessive degree. In my 6.5 years in the Legion, I almost never opened the Bible, except perhaps for the readings at Mass. Yet I can't count the number of Father Maciel's letters I read. It was always the same thing. My brothers, we must save the world from the hands of occult forces. Father Maciel generated a form of paranoia with regard to his enemies, with regard to the enemies of the Church, a compulsive paranoia that's still very much alive in the Legion today.
Maciel wanted to fascinate just as he himself was fascinated by leaders. When he spoke about Hitler or General Franco, it was with admiration. He was from a background that worshipped the supreme leader, the one who led the others. He admired leaders, and he was clearly influenced by figures such as Franco or Hitler.
They demanded from us the spirit of sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and held up as an example the Hitler Youth, who gave themselves entirely to their leader.
I eventually understood that access to information was totally sealed off. In the Legion, we only knew what they wanted us to know. We didn't watch TV, we didn't read newspapers. We didn't communicate with anyone, not even with the priests or seminarians on the outside. We were forbidden to speak to strangers.
Cult of the personality, totalitarian ideology, complete isolation, nothing was spared the legionaries of Christ. The method works, and the seminarians have lived by the same rules of conduct for 70 years.
And you, what are you doing for Christ?
It's a system which leaves you no free time. From dawn to dusk, you spend your time running. I remember the first night I spent with the novices. At 5:15 a.m., the lights came on, and a superior came by in the corridor shouting, "Christ our Lord, Christ our Lord, Christ our Lord." And the novices had to leap out of bed shouting, "Thy kingdom come." And then you'd see the priests running like crazy towards the showers, because the first one there will be the first one to arrive in the chapel, and thus be seen as a good priest. So from morning to night, you spend your time running. You have no time for yourself. The system is highly depersonalizing. One of the main tools of these sectarian systems is to deprive you of sleep. Our sleeping hours were reduced to a minimum, so when you got into bed, you were totally exhausted. I would just flop into bed and fall asleep almost immediately.
To relieve the solitude of his daily life, the legionary is allowed to write to his loved ones once a month. But even there, he's carefully monitored.
I could write to my mother once a month, but my letters were monitored by my superior. If I said anything that was considered inappropriate, my letter would be given back to me and I'd have to correct what I had written. I'm very sentimental. I remember once signing my letter, "Your dear son, Paul."
Your dear son, Paul.
And the superior reprimanded me, saying, "It's no longer Paul." And I had to correct it with, "Your dear son, Paul Lennon, novice in the Legion of Christ."
Another constraint, the legionary has to write every month to Maciel, the founder, who is supposed to answer him personally. In reality, it's the priest in Maciel's service who reply to the seminarians.
We were told that Father Maciel only slept 3 hours a night. and that all his time, or thereabout, was devoted to his legionaries. He spent it answering each one of us personally. He knew every one of us. And we, young cretins that we were, believed him. We were really taken in. They had us believe that it was he who was writing to us, and I believed it. I remember I would open each letter I received from him in front of the Blessed Sacrament. That was the tradition, because it was the Holy Spirit coming to enlighten me. What's terrible, though, is that I revealed very personal things about myself, relationship problems, emotional problems. And with regard to confessional secrecy, it was almost the same thing. It was a priest, priests. But it was a continual rape, a rape of the conscience.
How
does the Legion of Christ function? It has an educational system, a control system, a cult of the personality system. All this reinforces the idea that all these elements are those of a congregation and a sect, totally embedded in each other. The Legion of Christ is a sect.
How could a religious movement with methods similar to those of a sect and inside which children are sexually abused have flourished in the name of Christ for over 70 years? This photo is a form of answer to the question. Following the example of John Paul II, Martial Maciel and his troops have been protected by all the popes who have succeeded each other since 1941.
I greet, in particular, the legionaries of Christ.
The latest act of protection, this public tribute by Benedict XVI in 2011, as if the Pope was unaware of the crimes committed in the Legion. During our investigation, we found documents that up until now had been kept secret by the Vatican. Crucial documents, 213 in all, which help understand the protection from which Martial Maciel benefited. We've laid these 213 exhibits end to end. They make up a total of 40 meters, representing 70 years of the secret life of the Legion of Christ. It's Fernando Gonzalez, a Mexican academic, who convinced the Vatican Archives custodians to bring out these long-hidden documents. A partial collection, since files on the Legion of Christ are still stocked in 3 other places in Rome.
It wasn't complicated for John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger to demand to see the file on Maciel, to get an idea of what had been going on since 1944, and to discover all the denunciations that have accumulated since then.
These 213 documents, kept secret until now, are made up of denunciation letters of damning reports for the congregation and its coercive methods, but also and especially for the Legion's founder. An example, a very explicit letter from a Mexican bishop in August 1956.
He sends a denunciation letter to Rome concerning Martial Maciel, and he gives details: devious conduct, lies, drug abuse, acts of sodomy with boys of the congregation. This was sent by Sergio Méndez Arceo.
The accusations are so serious in nature that in that same year, 1956, Maciel is removed from the ministry by the Vatican following an apostolic investigation. However, he'll return 2 years later. Another vital piece of evidence is a long letter written in 1976 addressed to Maciel by Juan Jose Vaca, 6 months after leaving the Legion of Christ.
It would be a very grave scandal if the competent authorities discovered your acts of sexual abuse. Other than the sexual abuse, the serious damage to my moral, psychological, and mental integrity. For the well-being of the Church, I ask you to recognize these grave facts and resign from your honorable office. Juan Jose Vaca, October 20th, 1976.
Pensé escribirle.
I wanted to write to him, not only to reproach him, but also to ask him to explain all those abhorrent acts he's committed throughout his life, starting with his sexual abuse of myself since the age of 13 in 1950, and which went on for almost 12 years. As his only answer, he more or less threatened to destroy me if I continued talking about him in public.
La Correa, es la carta que él envía donde ya habla de la...
Que él abusó también.
Sí, que él abusó después también. Él ya había abusado.
213 documents. The Church knew all about it, everything. You can find explanations, excuses, but even so, when you read the conclusions of the first apostolic visitation, everything is there. There's a document summarizing all the accusations that were previously made. In 1956, a document summarizing all the complaints, all the letters that had been sent. This means that there were people who had consolidated the information. Maciel did this, Maciel did that. How did he manage to escape being brought to justice?
It's a proven fact that from Pius XII to John Paul II, the Vatican was informed about Maciel's crimes. But what about Benedict XVI? In a book interview given to the German journalist Peter Siewald, former Cardinal Ratzinger claims that he was only informed at a very late date about Maciel's case.
Grazie.
We only had concrete evidence from the year 2000. For me, Maciel remains an enigma. He had a life, we know that now, out of moral bounds, an eventful, wasted, twisted life.
Ratzinger's lying when he claims that he didn't know anything until the year 2000. Ratzinger had all the pieces of evidence at his disposal at least since 1998. He had access to all the necessary secret documents, and I can't believe that someone as high up as he didn't consult them. That was part of his obligations, to concern himself with and to demand the Maciel file. He who was soon going to be set up as an example to youth.
From 1981 to 2005, Cardinal Ratzinger was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican's Disciplinary and Complaints Committee. None of the complaints of the 8 former legionaries in 1997 could thus have escaped his attention. Press articles about these complaints were first published in the United States, then in Mexico, still in 1997. And then, more particularly, there was the illustrative Alberto Atié case. In 1994, this Mexican priest meets a legionary of Christ, Father Amenaba, whom we see in this photo at the side of Maciel. Father Amenaba feels that he's close to death and wants to speak to a priest. Alberto Atié will hear his confession.
Él había sido no solamente abusado sexualmente, sino que él también había llevado.
Father Amenaba not only told me that he'd been sexually abused himself, but that in his turn he'd brought other boys to the infirmary, and on several occasions had served as strategist for Maciel to put a stop to the denunciations against certain of his priest colleagues, also child abusers, in 1982.
Que habían abusado de niños en 1982
Father Amenabar was a victim, an accomplice, but also a hatchet man.
Y él fue también un victimario.
After receiving this explosive information on the Legion of Christ and its founder, Alberto Atié alerts the very influential Mexican Cardinal Norberto Rivera. But the Cardinal won't listen to him. For him, Maciel is just a victim of a conspiracy plot.
Through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault.
Realizing that Maciel is protected in Mexico, Alberto Atié decides to inform the Vatican. In 1998, he turns to a friend, a bishop, Monsignor Talavera, who agrees to take his written testimony to Rome. Upon his return, Monsignor Talavera relates his discussion with Cardinal Ratzinger, future Benedict XVI, who is at that time very close to the Pope, John Paul II.
Me dijo, leyó la carta.
Monsignor Talavera told me that Cardinal Ratzinger read my letter in front of him and asked him, "Do you know the priest who wrote this letter?"
Sí, Eminencia. ¿Usted cree
"Yes,
que
Your
el
Eminence."
sacerdote
"Do you think that the author of this letter is a morally trustworthy person?"
moralmente?
"Yes, Your
Sí,
Eminence."
Eminencia.
"Do you
¿Usted
think
cree
that
que
what he
lo
has
que
written is
escribe es
truthful?"
verdad?
"Yes, Your Eminence."
Sí, Eminencia.
"Do you think that what is
¿Usted
written
cree
here
que
is
es
true?"
verdad
"Yes, Your
lo que
Eminence."
está escrito aquí? Sí, Eminencia. Y entonces la respuesta.
And Cardinal Ratzinger's response was, "Monsignor, I sincerely regret it, but it's impossible to open Father Maciel's file because he's a person held in high esteem by the Holy Father, and he's done a lot of good for the Church. I'm sorry, but it isn't wise."
No es prudente.
Sickened, Alberto Atié will leave the priesthood 5 years later, in 2003. He now militates alongside former legionaries. He co-authored a book, The Will Not to Know, recently presented in Mexico. A book denouncing the law of silence imposed by the Church for 70 years with regard to the Legion of Christ.
Even though I'm still a believer and continue to practice my religion and haven't lost my faith, I nonetheless feel a lot of resentment towards the Church because it's the Church that deceived us. It should have protected us. It didn't.
Throughout his life, Maciel was able to rely on the support of a protective network of cardinals and bishops at the Vatican. Influential men whose every secret he knew.
He was very much at home at the Vatican. He was really in his element. From the outset, he used his charm, kept company with the monsignors, everyone. I think he knew the failings of each one of these monsignors and cardinals, so he played a sort of blackmail game. Blackmail is a recurrent method used by Maciel. Maciel had only to bring his connections at the Vatican into play, because a certain number of cardinals were completely won over by him. They saw the Legion as a magnificent achievement. So many priest vocations when things aren't looking too good for the Church. It's marvelous. It's the solution to all our problems. And of course the founder can't be bad since he's created this wonderful congregation. And that's how he got away with it finally.
Yet the protective wall built around the Legion's founder will soon start to crack. In 2002, a book damning for Maciel comes out in Spain, and inside the Legion, the superiors can't avoid speaking about it.
I understand that attacks have been directed against Father Maciel, and they answered us with, "It's a small group of former legionaries who have a personal grudge against the Legion and want to take revenge." And obviously, they tell us that we can't read the book. And the superior adds, "If someone wrote a libelous book about my mother, I wouldn't read it."
To combat these attacks, Maciel promotes himself as the virtuous father. And the means he uses in-house are sometimes far from subtle. For example, in this crudely edited video film, the filmmaker compares Maciel to Jesus enduring his agony. The message is clear. Maciel is the victim of slander and libel, and it's the outside world that wants to destroy the Legion of Christ. The resulting paranoia will thus serve to create a unified front. This is how, protected on all sides, the Legion of Christ's influence within the Catholic Church will grow. A handful of Mexican children in 1941, and 70 years later, 1,000 ordained priests in a strategic position in Rome.
Pues quedo extrañado, maravillado.
I will always be surprised, amazed by the Legion's rate of progress. So many achievements in so little time that one may ask oneself, how is it humanly possible?
To establish his power, Marcial Maciel relied on the network of 70,000 lay Christians belonging to Regnum Christi and over 300,000 volunteer workers. In 70 years, the Legion of Christ amassed a fortune of $20 billion. It's present in 18 countries, owns 158 schools and 22 universities, such as the prestigious Anahuac University of Mexico City, for example.
Líder de acción positiva.
An immense site worthy of any American university campus. 11,000 young people studying diverse disciplines congregate here every day. Using a hidden camera, we attempted to meet with the university's Legionary of Christ rector.
Y entonces lo que vamos a hacer es que nosotros esto se lo planteamos al padre, ¿ok? Y nosotros nos pondríamos en contacto con ustedes.
Muy bien.
¿De acuerdo?
The rector of Anahuac University will never contact us. Other than education, another of the Legionnaires' missions is to gain access to certain social circles, preferably the wealthy ones. This was the case in Paris in the early 2000s. The Legion of Christ set up a center here called Business Generation, via which it was able to get close to influential and generous business owners. Dinner debates were organized on the themes of ethics, Christian values, and faith. From 2000 to 2006, a Legionary of Christ close to Marcial Maciel is in charge of operations in Paris. His name is Rafael La Roca, a charming and persuasive priest, an actor with multiple faces at ease in every circle. Business Generation no longer exists today, but Rafael La Roca has remained a friend of certain French business owners who are still under his spell.
C'est un commercial. C'est un commercial né.
He's a born salesman. Some are and some aren't. He is. He's very gifted and he would have made a great lobbyist. But his mission was to evangelize as much as possible and also find financing for his congregation's works, in particular, the educative works, which required a great deal of financing.
In hindsight, doesn't it bother you that all this is very much removed from the apostolate and the training of young priests?
It's one of the missions of the Church and of certain congregations, such as the Legionaries of Christ, to educate young people.
He's a man who's at the same time pure, determined, and fundamentally honest. And believe me, in today's business world, and in other worlds too, it's quite rare. I think that if he'd continued in that order, he would have ended up an archbishop.
You think so?
I'm sure of it.
And what makes you say that?
Because he had everything it took to rise up in the church hierarchy. Not only did he have the ability, but he also had the calling. You know, the order is very close to the papacy, and when one is close to God, it's much easier.
So they would attract people to some magnificent setting, an art auction house, for example. It's a system of capillary action reaching high-caliber individuals at top management levels in all fields, in the business world, in the media world, in the episcopal world, too, in order to establish political influence.
asseoir un pouvoir politique.
Xavier Ayrault and Stanislas de Saint-Agathe, who worked for the Legion of Christ, have often walked along this same path in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. This sumptuous villa, now uninhabited, was the headquarters of the Legion of Christ in France. It's here in 2004 where Raphael Larocca organizes a dinner bringing together Martial Maciel in person and businessmen such as Claude Bébéat and Martin Bouygues. The former CEO of AXA refused to speak to us, and Martin Bouygues let us know that he would never have attended this dinner if he'd known who Martial Maciel really was. Cecilia Attias, ex-Sarkozy, who also dined with Maciel in 2004, didn't want to comment. The entryism methods of Raphael Larocca in the Legion of Christ are not unanimously approved. Those who have worked at his side consider that the clerical collar was just a reassuring gateway through which to gain access to a circle of rich and sometimes vulnerable people.
The biggest part of the Legionnaires' fortune comes from old people who were deceived and subsequently fleeced, first by Maciel and then by his successors. A typical example is that of Dorothy de Premio-Real, an American billionaire. Father Raphael started visiting this old lady 3 times a week. I myself was invited by Father Raphael to accompany him on one of his visits. And there I witnessed a very distasteful theatrical performance. It was extremely unpleasant.
Raphael Larocca is no longer a priest today. He lives in Argentina. Contacted by us, he declined our request for an interview. While information concerning Martial Maciel's crimes was already in circulation at the time of these dinners in 2004, the Legion of Christ will finally be halted in its growth momentum in 2006 when the Vatican removes its founder and sends him into retirement. Maciel dies in 2008 in the United States, and his life suddenly becomes public information.
We're going to discover that he raped 50 or so children, that he had mistresses right, left, and center whom he maintained in sumptuous villas, that he raped his own children, that he was a drug addict, a spiritual plagiarist, a forger who falsified documents, an incessant liar, and so on and so forth. When I heard the news, I knew it was a case of not seeing the forest for the trees. I burst out laughing because it was a liberation at last. And my second reaction was to break down and cry, because I realized that for 70 years, the Church had condoned a monstrous wrongdoing, had trampled on the victims.
None of our witnesses was heard by the Vatican emissaries who had nonetheless carried out an apostolic investigation in 2010. In March 2012, Benedict XVI is in Mexico and refuses to meet with the sexually abused victims of Martial Maciel. The Vatican declined our request for an interview with its spokesman. In France, the Legionaries of Christ keep a low profile. None of the congregation's heads agreed to talk to us despite our repeated requests.
Bonjour. Bonjour. Et j'aurais tout simplement voulu pouvoir avoir le point de vue d'un responsable de la Légion du Christ.
On verra ça la semaine prochaine.
We will never be contacted. So we decided to approach the Legionaries of Christ in a different manner by attending an open day at the Apostolic School of Méry-sur-Marne in the Paris region, a school belonging to the Legionaries of Christ and which provides secondary education. Our guide is a welcoming and smiling priest. The visit begins, of course, with the chapel.
Christ is very beautiful. He comes from Spain.
Is it due to the present crisis that the Legion of Christ is experiencing? The fact remains that this school has lost half of its students. Nonetheless, in a presentation video, the legionary priests attempt to give the best impression possible of the establishment. This idyllic picture can't hide the Legion's founder's criminal life. A dark cloud in the picture that one of the people in charge of the apostolic school would well like to erase.
I like the founder very much, but I never wanted to be a priest for him. I wanted to be a priest for God. I felt that God had called me for myself. The fact that Maciel had this life really saddens me. This man who was destined to become a saint. And today the founder is reduced to nothing. That makes me very sad for him. But I think that history will do justice to this man. How could such a man as twisted and evil as they say he was have created a community such as this?
The Legionaries of Christ remain under surveillance today, under the Vatican supervision, but they continue to provide priests to the Church. In fact, 49 legionaries were ordained priests in December 2011. Rome has officially recognized the sexual crimes of the Legion's founder and presented as excuses to its victims. Other cases of sexual abuse have been committed by legionary priests, but the Vatican seems to be turning a blind eye to them and considers that the Legion of Christ is healthy. Those thinking the opposite remain unheard in Rome, and they're still waiting for the truth to come out. Francisco Parga, who was one of the Legion's high-ranking priests, left in 1971 before getting married. Paul Lennon left the priesthood in 1984, and he's now a psychotherapist and sect specialist. Jose Barba, after leaving the priesthood, studied at Harvard, got married, and became a teacher. Juan Jose Vaca is no longer a priest. Now also married, he lives in the United States. Xavier Leger has returned to his philosophy studies, which he'd abandoned in order to become a legionary of Christ. He got married and is presently writing a book relating his 6.5 years in the Legion.
When it rains, it pours, as down in her look Tammy realises in our midweek movie starring Melissa McCarthy and Susan Sarandon. That's Wednesday night at 10:25 here on RTE1. Stay with us now though, it's Legion of Christ next.